So in terms of what's going on with anxiety, if we take a look at just the rates of mental illness overall, from a worldwide perspective, 1 out of every 4 people across the world will experience some form of mental illness. So we know this is something that's happening globally, and we know that actually it's something that's occurring more and more in kids. So it's important that we not only start to recognize the signs and symptoms early, but that we also intervene early, because what we know is that the earlier we identify and intervene, the better the outcomes. Now for anxiety, anxiety disorders are actually the most common forms of pathology that we see in childhood. And while they typically begin around age 11, we know that some kids, even in preschool, can really struggle with anxiety. Do we have any preschool teachers or early elementary teachers? Are you seeing it already with your little ones? Yeah. So for those kids for whom it's pretty strongly biologically driven, or perhaps for kids that have experienced some significant trauma, we do tend to see these symptoms emerging at earlier ages. Now, gender differences for the little ones tend to be very small, but then we see an increase that occurs for more girls than boys, especially around the time of puberty. And then what happens is that we want to make sure that for those kids that are struggling with one anxiety disorder, that we really do put in place intervention right away, because if not, about 50% of them will develop a secondary anxiety disorder. The other piece that happens is that, especially in early childhood, the mechanisms that drive anxiety and depression tend to co-occur. And so what we want to do is also focus on treating the anxiety, because by doing that, later on we can actually prevent the symptoms of depression from emerging. There are a lot of kids that, if they go untreated, develop symptoms of depression and or substance abuse disorders. And I know I don't need to tell you how critical it's been in terms of substance use difficulties that our youth are experiencing. So anything that we can do early on to kind of manage these symptoms is really trying to do treatment ahead of time, if you will. When it comes to depression, especially in young kids, we know that a family history of depression and exposure to a stressful situation are 2 of the most significant risk factors. And when I say stressful situation, one of the primary ones is a significant loss. So death of a parent is a really big one, but also significant separation. So for example, through divorce or incarceration of one of the parents. Or it can be other loss. So for example, loss of a home, loss of significant friendships. It doesn't have to be necessarily just by death. The other really, really significant stressor that can occur, as you can imagine, is some sort of abuse, be it in the form of neglect, sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. So those are the primary risk factors for very little ones, and the secondary one is biology. So for what we call unipolar depression, which is really just the low symptoms, it can be up to about 66% can be accounted by genetics in terms of the development of it. When we talk about bipolar disorder, if one or both parents struggle with bipolar disorder, kids have 5 times greater likelihood of actually developing it. When kids are little, there's actually a very small incidence of depression, although unfortunately we do know that even infants can develop depression, infants and toddlers. But we don't really see that unless we are experiencing pretty extreme conditions. We tend to start seeing it more around 4th grade, start seeing some of the development of the symptoms, and then it really has its increase around middle school. And the average age of onset for that is between 11 and 14 years of age. By about 18 years old, up to 25% though, of our youth will experience some episode of clinical depression. So what that means is there's really a pretty big spike that occurs between middle school and high school. And again, what we know is that the earlier we treat, the better the outcomes. If we have kids that go through an episode that is untreated, then there's a pretty high likelihood, as you can see by these statistics, of relapse. The greater the numbers of clinical episodes that they go through without treatment, the more likelihood that it will become a chronic illness into adulthood. And so again, what we're trying to think about is early intervention and prevention. And so the earlier we get it, then we can really think about improving quality of life later on, but also improving things like academic outcomes, improving relational outcomes. All of those things are really critical. Okay. Now, the symptoms actually show up a little bit differently based on the age range, and so I wanted to share that with you. Preschool age, as I mentioned, if you have a preschooler who's actually struggling with depression, that's pretty severe. And so you are very likely to see a child that's very withdrawn, that has very, very low energy, is having a very hard time with developmental milestones, with growing and flourishing, and certainly with relationships. By school age, you tend to see a presentation that looks almost like you would imagine it's anxiety first, because there's so much co-occurrence with those anxiety symptoms. There can also be a pretty high co-occurrence with disruptive behaviors, so like yelling, acting out, what might look a little bit more like ADHD, or what might look a little bit more like ODD. And so what happens is a lot of these kids tend to initially be misdiagnosed because we think that either, one, it's a learning disability, or it's more of an acting out type of diagnosis. So what I always encourage people to do is, if you see this kind of acting out behavior, always have another lens to say, is this being driven by what we call a more agitated type of depression? Younger adolescents, 10 to 14-year-olds, tend to be pretty clingy in some ways, really nervous. They have a lot of physical symptoms, so a lot of headaches, a lot of stomach aches. I'm sure they present, to the nurse's office quite often. And what happens is that this type of anxiety tends to be really focused on worries of the future. So you hear a lot of, but what if this? But what about that? And what if this doesn't happen? So you start hearing a lot of feeling helplessness, feeling like things happen without their control, and they get very, very nervous around that concept. Then we move on to the older adolescents, and by this point, if the symptoms haven't really been treated, there's an increased sense of hopelessness that surrounds them. So, why am I even going to bother taking care of that? Nothing changes anyway. Or middle school was terrible. Why is high school going to be any different? There's a sense of kind of giving up or not really trusting that interventions will work. And so again, this is another reason why I think if we tend to see this earlier, younger kids tend to be more willing to accept therapy or to go to treatment. With older kids, it can be sometimes quite a challenge to actually even get them through the door. So one of the things that we're really trying to think about is, from a prevention perspective and from a mental health perspective, how can we start teaching every single child, not just those that are already developing some of these symptoms, the kind of coping skills that will help them, so that even in the event that they do develop some of the symptoms, one, they'll be able to recognize them, they'll be able to tell us what's feeling different because they'll have better self-awareness, and two, they'll be more receptive to the language of emotions and treatment. So that is really ultimately our hope, is that we create a culture where looking at these things, looking at emotional wealth, emotional wealth would be wonderful too, but emotional health and well-being actually are just as important and focused on as academic success. Okay. So to tell you a little bit about the impact across the disorders, I wanted to share with you a bit about what the internal experience of the kids are, because I think this can really help you maybe see behaviors in the classroom a little bit differently, or maybe help understand some interactions a little bit differently. So there's a huge level of shame proneness. What that means is that they feel very shameful of things that happen. And it could be something like, you know, by accident I broke this. Now, if I broke this, I would feel terrible, right? But I wouldn't think that it was because of me, because I'm a bad person, this broke. But what happens is that kids that really struggle with anxiety and depression take on sort of the bad things that happen and make the leap that it's because of me that this is happening. It's because of me that I have no friends. It's because of me that mom is feeling stressed. And so they feel a lot of shame about what's happening. They also feel a lot of shame about their symptoms. So, for example, you might have a 3rd or 4th grader that is feeling really anxious, can't really concentrate, and decides that he's going to rip up a piece of paper, the homework that he was given, he's going to rip it up, he's going to throw it to the ground and say, forget it, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. Now, if you have a child in your classroom that does that, and then that episode is followed by really intense tears and just looking devastated about what happened, it's probably likely that it's driven by either anxiety or depression or a combination. Because usually what happens with kids with externalizing disorder is that they feel very justified in having ripped up that piece of paper. Like, nope, it was your fault you gave me that piece of paper, I didn't want it, I'm going to rip it up. And that sense of responsibility for that isn't as prominent. For kids that really struggle with internalizing disorders, they will worry about what that action just did to the relationship with you. Their worry is that you're not going to like them anymore, or their worry is that they're never going to be able to do well because of these symptoms that they feel they can't control. So it's usually followed by a lot of tears, and a lot of times arguments with parents, arguments with teachers will be followed by this kind of very regretful response. Poor functioning on emotional regulation. So one of the things that I mention in the book is that self-regulation is a really critical component of emotional well-being, right? Think about it. If you can't, not only the piece that has to do with, you know, paying attention, sitting still, being able to focus, that's one part of regulation. The other part of regulation has to do with, if I'm really mad at you, then I'm not going to jump over the desk and do something about that. I'm going to actually think about, well, why am I mad at you? How else could I handle that? And so for kids that really struggle with anxiety and depression, their self-regulation is often impacted by thoughts that won't stop running around in their heads. They're always looking around for a potential threat, and they're really concerned that something will go wrong. Now, imagine trying to focus in the classroom when all of this is going on in your mind. It's going to be really difficult to remember things. It's going to be really difficult to be able to shift attention and learn something new. So it's really important to think about, how is the self-regulation that they're having related to emotions impacting their academic functioning, right? And I think often that's the piece that we miss. And when we try to separate academic functioning from emotional functioning, you really can't do that. Because if my brain isn't there and I'm not able to regulate myself internally, I'm not going to be able to take in what's going on from a learning perspective. So kids with anxiety and depression will often focus more on the negative rather than on positive outcomes. So maybe they were struggling a child was struggling in math, and he got a D in the first test, but then got an A in the second test. What do you think will stand out the most? The D. Why do you think the A happened? What will be his interpretation of why the A happened?
It was easy.
He got lucky. It was really easy. He got lucky. All of those things are external to himself, right? And so that self-efficacy, that sense of mastery and control are really lacking. There's also a lot of avoidance. And so avoidance related to, I don't even want to try something that might feel scary, or I don't want to take a risk in doing something. This is something that is consistent from elementary school through high school. Kids that really struggle with anxiety, getting up and doing a presentation in front of class, or having to give a speech or something like that can be really painful. And the reason is, most of the time there's an element that has to do with that social anxiety piece. What are other people going to think of me? What if I make a mistake? What if I don't do this right? What if somebody laughs at me? And so sometimes the resistance you might see in, I'm going under the table, I'm not going to do anything, or no, I don't want to participate in that group, or you might see it a lot in absences. Okay. And then finally, there's a lack of healthy emotional regulation strategies. So I'm sure you've all been in the situation where you have a student when he or she has a big meltdown, right? And you're saying, but what's going on? What's happening? I don't know. Well, I can't help you if you don't tell me what's going on, but I don't know what's going on. Well, how can I help you? I don't know. And so what happens is we try to engage them in that moment around problem solving. And the kids are really stuck in a place where problem solving is not going to be a really helpful solution at the moment, because they're so caught up in that lack of regulation, and they're so caught up in how things are difficult that stopping, making a plan, evaluating solutions is just not going to happen right at that moment, right? So in terms of when kids are having a really hard time, one of the best things to do at that moment is just to help ground them. And one of the best ways to do that is by using your relationship with them. So, you know what, I can tell that you're having a really hard time right now. I just want you to look at me, and I just want you to breathe right now so that your body can be calm and so that you can just listen to me. That's all I need right now, okay? So why don't we take a walk together? Or why don't we just sit over here together? Basically, all you want is to get those executive functions to kind of come back into place, right? At that moment, the kids are functioning from this part of their brain, right? The alarm systems are going off, they're worried that things are going to happen. So you want to calm them down enough so that they could get to this top level thinking. And that's when they'll be able to do some problem solving. Okay. By the way, if there are any questions along the way, I don't want to make you hold on to them until the end. Just let me know if you have questions or if there's anything you want me to clarify. Okay, so we know this, right, from working with kids individually, but we also are getting a lot of research that's giving us the kids' perspective. What is it that kids are feeling or not feeling related to how they are connected or feeling safe in the context of schools? So there was a huge national study that took place of close to 350,000 middle and high school students across the United States. And what they found was that almost 150,000 students, about 50%, felt that they had not developed these really key concepts related to being connected with schools, to teachers, to students. They felt they had not developed social competencies like empathy, decision-making, and conflict resolution. So this is what they're perceiving. What that translates into is that only 29% of them felt that their school provided a caring environment. So if you're feeling disconnected, if you're feeling like you don't have those skills, then that leads to things like chronic disengagement. And we know that about 60% of kids indicated that they were chronically disengaged from schools. Now this is a really big problem, because if they're disengaged, how are we going to get their motivation to go up? Right? How are we going to convince them that there are really good outcomes that can happen? How are we going to build that internal motivation for them to have that drive to be able to continue to try? Even though they failed, they continue to try. How do we do that if they're chronically disengaged? So that's one piece, right? The other piece then is, if we go back to the kids that we have been talking about, those that are struggling with anxiety and depression, they actually are actively, if they're actively rejected by their peers, they report even higher levels of anxiety and depression. So we're dealing with a couple of things. We're dealing with how are the kids connected to us as adults, and how are the kids connected to each other. And to me, that's the foundation of social emotional learning. We have to figure out how to get rid of that chronic disengagement, and that's not going to happen by having a child participate in a curriculum and then that's it. It's taken care of. We actually need to create opportunities for them to feel these social connections and to practice them in a way that they feel safe. Okay, so for us to kind of understand this, right, because sometimes the behaviors can be a little challenging, and I think sometimes it can be hard to say, why can't you just pay attention for a moment, or why can't you just, we've been doing this for the entire school year. Why are you still having a hard time with this transition, right? It's hard for us not to think that sometimes. And one of the things that helps me is to kind of reshift my framework in that instead of kids saying to us, I won't, which implies that they're consciously making a choice that they're not going to, it's that they can't, right? So truly, they're having a hard time, and they can't. They're not on purpose saying, I'm not going to do this. They can't say how I feel. I can't make my body stop. I can't make my mind stop. I can't control my feelings, and I can't find other things to do. I'm wondering, when you guys get stressed, who has a hard time shutting their brains off? Right? So what happens? It's like it just won't stop talking to you, right? It just keeps going. Sometimes we feel like we can control that, right? We're like, okay, you know what? I'm not going to worry about that until tomorrow. You know what? I'm just going to watch the show, and I'm going to just let my brain rest. Well, kids that are really actively struggling, particularly with anxiety, can't really do that. That's why we see so many sleep problems associated with it. That's typically why we see so many kids, especially in high school, that they miss a lot of the early classes because they have a hard time. The pattern usually is that they have a hard time falling asleep, then they have a lot of frequent night awakenings, and then it's actually in that early morning period when they can get a little bit more sleep, but then they have to get up. So chronic anxiety and depression can result in pretty significant school attendance problems as well.